system.
Mashika?
Yes.
Okay, in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hello and welcome to Fin24. Today, Minister Nene presented the first budget of our 5th Democratic Parliament. Minister Nene stressed that on the one hand, our developmental path is limited by the resource constraints of the current economic outlook. On the other hand, it seeks to lift these constraints by supporting innovation and making markets work better. We now speak to experts to gain some insight into the overall economic outlook. With me in studio today, we have Shamir Khan from Element Investment Managers, and we have Toko Madonka, co-director of the AIDC and member of the Budget Justice Movement. Welcome.
Thank you, Mashika.
Shamir, let's get right into it. What are your views on the overall economic outlook from Budget 2015?
So I think it's quite a difficult economic environment we find ourselves in. And by and large, it's a relatively well-balanced budget from our point of view. I think there are some questions raised in terms of where you're going to increase taxes. We see the normal culprits coming up, sort of sin taxes and a bracket creep in terms of corporate taxes. Some people would say that it is probably easier to capture more tax with a more general tax, such as maybe raising VAT, but then also zero costing certain items, which would be beneficial to the lower and middle income.
But did we not see from the budget overall that nobody wants to be upsetting the apple cart here? There was no real big surprises. And Toko, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I have a few highlights from the minister's speech. I think he started off very well, talking about people living in shacks, schools without sanitation, people living without sanitation, patients without care. Mm-hmm. But there was no sense of urgency in the next set of pronunciations. So we would have liked to have seen a stronger stance and a far more aggressive position around tax policy and the opportunities that the personal income tax review could have provided in terms of providing much needed resources to support greater increases in social grants, for example, for ensuring that our national health insurance can be paid for and functioning, that our health system really gets sorted out at the provincial level, and that we see greater movement and capacity within our municipalities to provide for basic services.
So, Toko, can I ask, do you see our budget 2015 as having missed the opportunity to take advantage of avenues that could really have helped upliftment on socioeconomic places in our society?
Absolutely. You know, one of my colleagues said it's a cowardly reshuffling in terms of the personal income tax. And at the same time, there's no sense that you know, people are really struggling. 1 in 4 South Africans are going hungry. It's embarrassing, the conditions under which many South Africans are expected to live and survive and work, and to talk about the UIF in terms of the amount of money that could be unlocked to pay the unemployed to be able to provide much needed demand in our economy that we're just not seeing. So we see our social protection, and I mean the minister did talk about a review around our social protection system in South Africa, but we're not seeing it going further enough. And the many protests that we're seeing across the country that are becoming more and more violent and are growing more and more in terms of tribalism or ethnicism and xenophobia is an indication that government is not doing enough through the public purse to enable people to bring themselves out of poverty.
So what we are actually saying is that this opportunity could have been taken to alleviate poverty on a far greater level than what it has been used for. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, when you say it, then it sounds like it's a very easy thing to do. But there are two sides to the equation. There's the cost side and there's the income side. So it's fine to say we got to spend more on the poor, we got to spend more on social service, and most of us want that from a humane point of view. The problem is finding the funding for that. And the difficulty you have at the moment is that there is a very small income tax base paying a lot of money. So it's a question of how do you get more people either into the income tax base, or how do you get more from the system? And I think one of the issues you'll see that corruption comes up a lot of times in his speech. And I think that is a silent drain on the economy. And if we can start plugging that gap, then you should see more income available for social
Perhaps
spending.
if we stopped staying silent
Mhm.
on that, we might also, get in a little bit more there. What do you think, Toko?
Well, I think often economists, particularly conservative economists, like to set up this tension between sort of general middle class taxpayers, confidence in the system and the public service to deliver versus corruption. What is often not said is that the corruption is both in the public and the private sector. And we were very pleased to hear the Minister talk about illicit financial flows going out of the country, the issue with transfer pricing, what we've seen around Lonmin, for example. So we recognize that it's not an either or. We need to address corruption, yes, and I think the Minister made some very good pronunciations around greater control, what we talk about sunshine clauses, making sure that there's the more the transparency around open contracting, both in public and private, the more we see that. And South Africa is a signatory to the Open Government OGP initiative, and so we would expect him to say something strong. What I would like to disagree with my colleague here is that everybody pays tax. So in terms of this narrow tax base, in terms of personal income tax, yes, it is narrow because we live in an extremely unequal society. And so those who can should pay tax. And so the current burden, as you rightly point out, could be expanded if we start looking at the way in which workers are paid. So we also want to talk about the illicit financial controls or the corruption is actually a wage evasion to a certain extent. And wages are not a cost to the economy. They provide demand. And so when we're talking about demand, we're talking about money in the hand. So people can actually go out and buy the services.
Again, it is an opportunity that was missed.
Completely.
Shamir, we've got something that has come through. We have Justice Malala has commented on our social media platform. He said that it is sad that emerging and developing markets are growing at 4.5%, while Nene says we will do a measly 2%. That may be revised down. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you need to see it in context. Obviously, the electricity issue is a major issue because it affects production both in manufacturing but also mining. And mining is still a big component of our exports. Also, you'll see that commodity prices have come down. So if you compare us, the country to compare us probably closer to is in Australia rather than other emerging markets. And you'll see they are also looking at potentially downgrading their GDP, and they've actually cut interest rates.
So it's not as unusual as what it may seem.
No, and also you got to remember that some of those emerging markets in terms of their development are behind us. So you're seeing a lot of infrastructure development going into those countries, which is boosting their GDP.
Toko, we also have a comment from Muzi who says that when they said Eskom rates will increase, it shows that government is punishing the poor. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a component in which we would raise concern around these increases in terms of the electricity tariffs. If it's targeting big business, then we have no issues with it because we want to see a far more responsible business sector that moves towards a low carbon, far more smart energy use than we're currently seeing. They've been getting away with getting very cheap energy and abusing it to a certain extent. And so we want to see that dealt with. But from the perspective of the budget justice movement, and if you were following at all the United Front's calls, we are extremely aware of the impact that these have on poor communities. And in fact, these levies may not even be relevant to many communities because they can't even afford to access electricity because they're not living in decent housing anyway. So what we would want to see is a far more brave minister talking about gender-based violence, which we didn't hear. We heard again for the 5th year running empty promises around the NHI and NHI financing. When are we going to see this paper? It's actually making a mockery of Parliament that we have our ministers come before Parliament, promise to produce these documents, and then nothing happens. A year again later, we're getting a promise to deliver. So we really need to see a much stronger, braver,
much more aggressive
minister that sees the urgency that many people are dealing with on the ground.
On a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Toko. Thank you, Shamir. Please stay tuned to Fin24 as we continue our Budget Day broadcast. We'll be back soon looking at the tax implications of Budget 2015. We now continue with our Budget Day review, and we're looking at the tax implications of Budget 2015. Minister Nene has said that the 2015 budget tax proposals aim to increase tax revenues as required, limit the erosion of corporate tax base, increase incentives for small businesses, and promote a greener activity. With me in studio to explore the tax implications are Russell Smith, Tax Director of Ernst & Young. Welcome, Russell.
Hello.
And Keith Engel, Deputy CEO of the South African Institute of Tax Practitioners. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi.
Russell, let's get straight to it. What are your thoughts? Was there anything in particular that stood out for you in terms of the tax implications of Budget 2015?
Well, what struck me as quite odd was the lack of more broad-based increases. Whereas there's an increase in personal income tax and the fuel levy, nothing to do with VAT, no increase on dividends tax, no CGT increases, no state duty increases. So it was a relatively light touch, and I think that'll come as quite a relief, actually, especially to high net worth people.
I think people were expecting, specifically the high net worth people, were expecting pre-budget to be hit quite a lot harder than what they were.
Absolutely. And that's why I say I think there'll be quite a bit of a relief, actually. The 1% is a relatively light touch.
But how is that going to affect the income that is so greatly needed?
Well, they've managed to balance the budget somehow. There was about a 17 million shortfall on collections this year, which is not a huge figure. And there's a projected deficit next year of about, what is it, 3.9%, or 16 billion on revenue. Those are not absolutely huge numbers, and they've managed to sort of balance the budget without huge increases, which is actually quite a relief.
Keith, do you agree that this is quite a balanced budget?
Well, I mean, it's balanced in the sense you're balancing the budget, the revenue, and the expenditure. I think the point that Russell's making is absolutely correct. The point is that 12 billion sounds a lot of money to us, but to government overall it isn't that much. And what they did is they tried to spread it around. They went after personal income tax. They didn't go for the 2%. I think that was what a lot of people felt. They went to 1%, but it goes deeper down. So that made the number smaller, because if you had a 2%, you might have hit it at higher levels, 1.5 or 2 million rand. It looks like it's going to be felt deeper down to 1 million and below. So that is affecting it. The other thing to note is the fuel levy, and that the excise levies, there are various ones, like the electricity levy went up. So there are a number of it, they're spreading around in different ways so you don't feel it quite as much. So it starts to add up. They will get to the 12 billion, but that's where they did it. Personal income tax and excise with an element of environmental taxation in there.
Some people are saying that the minister was not aggressive enough in the spreading around of it. What are your thoughts on that, Russell?
I think he did a good job. There were some comments from the EFS that company taxes were left flat, which is a bad thing. Obviously, we don't agree with that. No, I don't think he was. The fact that he wasn't more aggressive with tax increases, I think, is a very good thing.
Is there anything in particular that stood out for you in terms of the personal tax and how it will be affecting man on the street, Russell?
I think the increases will be nominal. I mean, if they drew a line at 450,000 rand, so that if you're below that, you will actually be slightly better off. If you're above that, there will be an increase of 1% reduced by the bracket adjustment. So I would suggest that that's a fairly nominal effect.
Yeah.
Keith, any other thoughts on the tax implications of 2015?
Well, I think really just a more overall point is what struck me in the budget is the minister was trying to reverse a bad news story and make it a good news story. So just on the first point on revenue, look, I think they made the calculations. They've chosen a lot of rate things so that tax increases they know will come through. So they didn't do it in a lot of subtle ways. So I think the funding will come through. I think the real issue is on the expenditure side, whether the expenditure cuts are credible, and that's going to be the issue for the IMF and the rest. That's where the credibility problem is. But the other thing you consistently see is while they were doing an increase, overall in this budget, incentives for small business, we're trying to help the poor, we're trying to help growth. So there's a lot of effort and a lot of small initiatives to show you that they're doing everything they can, and it can show you that the Minister of Finance feels very constrained. He wants growth, he does not want to deter investment, both domestic or foreign, yet he's got to raise revenue. So there was a sensitivity that went throughout the whole speech.
A sensitivity, and again, a sense of not wanting to upset anything, not want to upset any particular sector. But do you think that sort of passive stance, for want of a better phrase, is going to catch up with us, Russell?
I don't think so. There was quite a lot of emphasis on green relief, although interestingly there was quite an interesting comment that there was an allocation towards the regulation around fracking and so on, so there was kind of a nod in that direction which kind of goes against the green theme. But quite a lot of emphasis on relief and enhanced electricity levy, and at the same time tax relief on energy savings or electricity savings. So I think that will be very welcome across the board as well.
Keith, tell me, what are your thoughts on the temporary increase in the electricity levy?
Well, you see, that was part of the delay in the carbon tax. I think there's been a push to get that carbon tax going, but they keep holding back for various reasons. So a temporary measure is to up the electricity levy, which is acting as a preliminary proxy for that carbon tax. And again, you're seeing a little bit of what Pravin Gordhan was doing. We're not increasing taxes, we're stopping you from sinning. So we're going after alcohol, going after cigarettes. There are new type of environmental levies of all sorts in there, and the electricity levy being one of them. Now the issue is that they're trying to sell it as an environmental thing. The question is, people feeling the way they do about electricity right now, was that a smart move? But again, the moves in tax, as Russell suggests, are as far as you need to go.
Okay.
They covered the gap. The real problem, again, is their credibility on the expenditure side.
Something that stood out for me, Russell, I'm just going to read it verbatim. We are also taking further steps to combat financial leakages, which deprive our economy of billions of rands through erosion of the tax base, profit shifting, and illicit money flows. I love that he touched on that. I love that he mentioned that. What does that say to you?
Well, what he's doing is he's lending a lot of support to the Davis Committee recommendations on base erosion. There's a lot of focus on this. It's a good thing. Actually, South Africa already has a lot of legislation in that space. They have good transfer pricing legislation. What they lack is the ability to implement it really effectively. And one of the recommendations, and I think he's supporting that, is that they need to bulk up the transfer duty capability of SARS in order to carry out effective investigations, which are not easy to do. So I think he's just lending his support to that whole base erosion initiative.
Also, something that again stood out, which we've really actually touched on, is the fact that he's gone out of his way to ensure that the burden is fairly distributed. Who do you think, if one could phrase it this way, was the worst off of the budget?
I would say, well, I guess-
Taxpayers doesn't seem to be coming off too badly at all. So,
Well, I mean, they had a 1% increase. So your upper middle class and your wealthy are getting hit there. And again, the fuel levy is going up, so the low income. Again, they're trying to show that everybody's sharing the burden. And if there's enough sharing, it may not be as sensational, but at least you're not angering certain parts of the population. So I do think they tried to minimize it as best they could. But again, we're going to feel it somewhere. There's going to be a hole in our pocket, and we're not going to quite sure know where it went.
do we know when, Russell?
When what?
When we might start feeling the
Well,
effects?
individuals will start feeling it with effect from next month, March. And the fuel levy will kick in more or less immediately as well.
See, you've actually been feeling it all along, because what happens is inflation goes up. Your taxes have been quietly going up over the course of the year. What the minister is supposed to do, if the economy was good, is he's supposed to reverse all that inflation from February, March. So you've been feeling on the personal income tax for a while. The 1% you'll feel immediately from 1 March, certain people anyway, the upper income.
So just to round up, Russell, what did you think of the
Overall,
budget?
very good. I'm very relieved actually that it wasn't more dramatic than it really is.
After the state of the nation, the state of the province?
And all the hype leading up to this particular speech as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we are relieved, and I think the point that Russell mentions is that the $12 billion wasn't as hard for him to cover. So on that side, I think we're all relieved. Again, the worry is the expenditure side credible? That is the question. And that we will see over a period of months or a year or two.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your input on this budget 2015. Stay tuned. We're going for a short break, and then we'll be back to look at labor and small business enterprises in terms of budget 2015. Welcome back to the continuation of our Budget 2015 broadcast. We are now looking at small business development and unemployment in terms of Budget 2015. Minister Nene has today told us that Cabinet has agreed on 9 strategic priorities to be pursued this year. Unlocking the potential of small enterprises is one of these priorities. With me in studio, we have Cobus Engelbrecht, Marketing Head of Sanlam Business Market, and Terry Bell, Inside Labour columnist for Fin24 and City Press.
Hi, Ms. Wickett.
Welcome, gentlemen. Cobus, how does what the Minister has said today in terms of small business development, in terms of making it a strategic priority, how do we ensure that the idea gets implemented?
Okay, well, let's just first take a step back. What business need is good infrastructure, a well-run government, obviously without corruption. Now, if we look at these proposals, they go some way to enhance that kind of environment. But the million-dollar question would be, will it be implemented in an efficient and an effective way? Because if we can do that, then surely it will promote and help business in South Africa.
Well, it's a question of the devil being in the detail again, let's face it.
Absolutely.
And there was no detail. Like so many other State of the Nation addresses, budget announcements, we have much public relations flannel and very little detail.
There was no real substance surrounding it. There was, again, no real detail. It didn't seem to be aggressive enough. It seemed to want to placate everybody and to fairly distribute.
I think that's what it's in
everything.
aid of. It's tinkering with things. I think Kobus would agree with me there, but tinkering with things on the edges. For example, I mean, it talks about a slightly more aggressive regime for small business, but it's such a small tinkering with it that it doesn't really matter. You know, the tax relief that's offered on that one. And as regards unemployment, I mean, at least Nene did say that, and I wrote it down at the time, our single greatest economic and social challenge is unemployment. Great, and then he leaves one sort of basic paragraph for it and doesn't give us any detail. Apart from, if someone could tell me, perhaps you can, Cobus, or you, Speaker, and that is that term that he used, what was it, a full-time equivalent job. What is that?
I really don't know.
No, nor do I.
Perhaps those who get paid for full-time work, they don't do full-time work, full-time equivalent.
You mean those who work for government who sit on the back benches?
Well, elaborating on what you've said about the detail, take for instance a businessman that's got some tax issue to sort out, that must go and sit in a queue at SARS for a whole day. That businessman should be closing deals, selling, managing his business. So now he's not as efficient as he should be.
Creating employment.
Well, creating employment for SARS, but decreating
Yes.
employment for the businessman. If that businessman could be 30% more efficient, he could make 30% more money. He could pay 30% more tax. He could employ 30% more people who will also be paying tax. That's the kind of stuff that we want.
So we're
Well,
talking about real ground level
Yes.
workable solutions.
Yeah.
Well, I would agree, and the point is here, I don't think either side's going to be happy, whether it's on the business side or the labour side. Because on the business side, that's the sort of thing you would want. On the labour side, there was no, for example, even the EFF conference, the Economic Freedom Fighters, why didn't they increase corporate tax? We swung in the last few decades from where corporate tax was the bulk of tax revenue to individual tax. Now individual tax has been increased still more, and corporate tax remains where it was.
Yeah.
Now that is a problem. Okay, it's been reduced in terms of small business, but it remains the same at, what is it, 28% or whatever it is.
Yes,
So, I
28%.
mean, it's lower than most states in the United States. It's lower than a lot of countries in Europe.
Terry, what do you say to, and let's quote the Minister, the Jobs Fund will spend 4 billion rand in partnership with the private sector on projects that create new employment, support work seekers, and address structural constraints to more inclusive growth?
Well, that's lovely. I mean, it's exactly what Cobus was saying. Projects. What projects? What are you going to implement? That's, I think it's in the same sort of paragraph where they mention that temporary, what's it called, a full-time equivalent job, 170,000, and 224 job opportunities. I quite honestly, I agree totally with the labour movement on this one. Job opportunities is a total waste. You employ people for 3 months or 6 months. You may give them barely adequate income over that period to feed themselves and their families. Barely adequate. What do they do for the other 3 or 6 months? It's nonsense, but they come off the statistics for unemployment, and that's always a useful thing to massage.
Cobus, can I ask you, when we look at what the Budget 2015 means for a young entrepreneur out there, when we look at what it means for a small to medium business owner, what did Minister Nene's speech today mean to those people?
Well, unfortunately, I can't say much, because to be a startup entrepreneur in South Africa, to go and register a company, to go and register as a taxpayer, it's hard. It's a simple thing to do, but it's hard because of the inefficiencies. It takes months to register a company. Now you need your company registered because you need to go and borrow money. They will only lend you the money once your company is registered. You need to get your business started up. I see nothing in this budget that will enable a young person to start a business.
Well, that will encourage a young person to start
It
a
won't
business.
encourage a young person. Somebody who starts a business today, in my mind, is an absolute economic hero, because it takes heroism to start a business.
And what you've got here is basically, from a Labour point of view as well, they're saying there's nothing in it for Labour. We may differ about how best to go ahead and in terms of job creation, but there's nothing there either. And that is a huge problem. We have a massive problem. We have a problem of debt too. If you talk about borrowing for an entrepreneur, we're on the brink, we're on the verge of having our paper, our bonds declared junk because of the debt that we owe. Now, Finance Minister Nene did say that they were pulling back from that verge. Quite honestly, looking at the figures he gave, I don't think so, particularly when you have the increase in grants, which are inadequate anyway. So what we needed was, I think, whether it be from the right or from the left, a radical approach, which we haven't had. More of the same.
Yeah, I just want to get back to what you earlier said about the government creating jobs. I don't think it's government's duty or place or job to create jobs. Leave that to the private sector. Create an environment where businesses thrive, and you won't have to worry about creating jobs.
So what you're saying is that Budget 2015 means nothing in the present space in which it is being presented. We need to be changing the environment. We need to be changing our economic climate. We need to be changing the way in which we do things, in which we handle small businesses. Is that what we're at?
I'm saying that, and I think it should start with our attitude. What should we do? Should we sit with a dwindling amount of money that we need to spend less and less, or should we sit down and create a big environment where we can go big and grow big? Then we have more to spend and we don't have to save. You know, like any good businessman will tell you, you don't save your business out of trouble. You trade yourself out of trouble. That's what we need.
But
That's
if
a
you're not
common
in the correct
denominator.
space, if you're not in the correct space to be doing the trading,
Correct.
you're not going to be doing the trading and there won't be growth.
Correct.
Terry, I've just got something from the Imperial which has come through on our social media platforms. He says, the Budget 2015 confirms our worst fears. The working class will forever carry the burden of our leaders' indecisiveness. They lack ideas. What is your response to that?
I agree with that entirely. And the point is, we have common ground here. You would like a radical transformation one way. I would support the Labour movement's idea of a radical transformation and the other way.
But we need radical and aggressive.
Indeed. But I mean, abolish VAT, which is a regressive tax. Introduce a transaction tax, a small percentage on every financial transaction, developed by a man called James Tobin. You can then abolish income tax, quite honestly, because it will draw in more money. The banks aren't going to like it, but that's a sort of radical. No, I'm not putting it forward as an answer. I'm just putting it forward as a sort of radical idea.
Well, you see, I agree with that kind of thinking, because to pay income tax on a regressive grade, you are punishing somebody for working hard. How does that work? I mean, that's not encouraging entrepreneurship, but if you punish, in inverted commas, somebody for spending, then you encourage people to save.
What about a temporary levy on electricity? I've seen many temporary levies, like income tax was introduced incidentally as a temporary measure.
Yeah.
It was a temporary measure. Thank you so much, gentlemen. We've come to the end of this interview, but I'd love to have you back again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please stay tuned to Fin24 and let's look at Budget 2015 in our next episode as to how South Africans perceive Budget 2015. Stay with us.
Good.
Welcome back to Fin24 Budget 2015. We are now looking at how ordinary South Africans and investors and everybody else abroad sees our Budget 2015. With me in studio, I have Salim Mohing, Brand Reputation Specialist at Dun Valley, and I have Ghalib Khalant, Western Cape Provincial Coordinator for the Right to Know. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, I'm going to get right into our social media. We have been flooded with social media on 2015. Matomi Signolo says, we keep hearing that we should tighten our belts. Some of us have tightened so much we cannot even breathe anymore. I think that is a general feeling of very, very many South Africans. Khalib, what do you think?
I mean, listening to the minister, one appreciates that he was in a tough situation. So he's charted a very conservative line, it feels like. I think commentators have also responded around going to taxpayers and asking for even more tax. So the hike on personal income tax is I think, going to hit everybody. What are we getting in return is really the question. So clearly the minister's outlined a number of the expenditure by government. Question for me is, at local government level, particularly at the coalface where people feel government expenditure, I'm not so sure that we're seeing the kind of trickle down that we are wanting on the ground. An example, for instance, would be strengthening municipalities and spending 4.3 billion rand, not on service delivery, but on building capacity, and that I assume would be of municipalities. So to read a balance sheet, for example. So it talks about potentially how broken the system is, that we're spending 4.3 billion rand on fixing a system rather than, in fact, talking about how many houses will be delivered. At this point in time,
we should be talking about what is going to have an effect on the ordinary citizen in the streets of South Africa. Sally, what was your take on it? How would you say the ordinary South African citizen and those abroad have perceived Budget 2015?
I think government needs to send more positive, confidence-building messages out there. South Africans feel that they are being asked to do stuff, but when you look at government, when you look at the president, when you look at people at ESCOM getting away with huge bonuses for delivering nothing, all those things are not sufficiently addressed in this. So we're saying, well, you government are asking us to tighten our belts, and that the tweet is very correct, but we don't see you doing the same thing. You're not sending us the right messages. So government needs to go much further than making another press statement, which is what it is really.
Yeah, which was very, very much what PR was spinning.
Exactly. I think, in my view, all budget speeches must start with 5, 10, 20 minutes of what we promised last year and how we've managed to deliver on it. And we don't do that. So each year we start afresh with what is being promised. We never get to know all those billions that are allocated to different things.
What has been delivered?
Exactly.
How have we delivered on what we have promised last year?
We need to build confidence inside South Africa. We also need to build confidence for brand South Africa. There was a time when people just loved coming here, whether to visit or to spend money, to invest, right? People now ask different questions about South Africa. I've heard people say, you guys have become too ordinary. You're not special anymore. Because of the way we behave, because of how we perceived outside. So the government needs to maintain that positive image of South Africa by the way it does things. And we're not seeing that happening.
Also, coming in again in what the perception of ordinary South Africans is, we have another comment. Tax increases so that ministers and MPs can get their 7% salary increase.
There you go.
Although they are going to be spending 8% less on Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets.
Oh, that's fantastic.
For example. So that's a big saving written in there. I think one of the things that stood out for me about the minister's speech was potentially just how out of touch our leaders are with ordinary people on the ground. So the joking one saw, for instance, in the speech, went around the cost of whiskey going up by 3 rand a bottle, for example. And so leadership, political leadership, then can joke around that because, in fact, it's a sort of in-joke. The impact of that on ordinary people, which is a much more serious thing, I don't think came through as clearly. One issue, for example, would be unemployment. Is one of the major, the minister even says, unemployment is one of the major issues facing South Africa, right? he spends, what, 5 sentences on employment rates. We're creating 224,000 job opportunities.
Sally, can I ask you, just to come in there, Khalib, can that be seen as being blasé about unemployment? Can ordinary South Africans see those 5 to 10 sentences as, you know what, we've resigned ourselves to the fact that this is unemployment and this is what we're doing about it, and that's it, let's move on? Is that what we're saying, Khalib? Is that what we're seeing? Every year we are saying, every budget speech, this is what we're going to do. And next year we'll come back and say, this is what we're going to do. And it's not just become such a part of the budget speech. You know, let's move on.
Well, I think we South Africans have to take a level of blame. I think we're behaving like chickens. We've developed memories of chickens because we sit here all the time together listening to all these promises being made, but we don't go back to these people to say, well, this is what we promised, and precisely what I said earlier. So we need also to be a bit more activist in the way we approach government.
There needs to be some sense of
promises.
Accountability.
Exactly.
And I love the fact that you're saying is that every budget speech should start out with, this is what we promised last year and this is how we have delivered. Do you think that will make a difference, Khalib, into how ordinary South Africans perceive what government means with budgets every year?
I mean, I think it's for us as ordinary South Africans to, in fact, demand that of every single minister, of the president, that when they address us as a collective, that we hold them accountable. So it is up to us to say, what have you done for us lately? In the words of the sort of Janet Jackson song. Because we've elected them into those positions in order to serve the people of South Africa. And so I like this idea of holding them accountable up front. What was interesting for me, though, and I just want to say, was what was not said. Because in fact, a lot was said.
And there was a lot that was not said.
But there was a lot not said. And for me, one of the issues that was not said, and a big elephant in the room, was around communication. Communication got one line in the speech. Minister spent some time looking at some of the state-owned enterprises. The post office is in dire straits, is under administration, SAA, etc., etc. We didn't say anything about SABC. It's another state-owned enterprise. It's sucking up money from the fiscus, and we're not getting the public broadcaster, in fact, that we deserve. So, a large thing that's absent from this, something very specific for the right to know, is our access to information.
Yes.
And so, ordinary citizens' access to information. And that can be through the public broadcaster, but also community media. We'd made demands year upon year upon year.
Again, there's no accountability for it, so nobody has to come back to us and say, what we promised you last year, we actually have or have not delivered. Sally, before we end, I want to know from you, how is Brand SA being perceived after SONA 2015, State of the Province and Western Province 2015, and Budget 2015? How is Brand SA being perceived?
Well, Budget 2015 is a promise, is a set of promises. So we need to wait and see what's going to be done about those. And like you said, the promises do not go far enough. I would like to have seen government on Eskom, for instance. Eskom is not able to carry the load on its own.
Yes.
Excuse the pun. They need assistance. Government needs to say, maybe 60% of our power, electric power, must come from Eskom, and 40% we must create more room for independent power producers. Then we'll see these guys coming in. There are many people out there in the private sector who have the capacity to come in there and contribute to lightening the load on Eskom, as it were. And the government is not doing that. So when government starts implementing these promises, then we'll start getting excited or not. But it's too early now to start making policy.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much.
Okay.
How many of you out there agree with our experts that government should be held accountable to the previous year's budget speech? Let us know. Thank you for watching Budget 2015 on fin24.com.